Hey little dreamers! Ready for a magical bedtime adventure? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a sleepy tale. Let's go! The wind is gentle tonight, brushing softly against the cliffside where an old lighthouse stands tall. Its walls are painted in faded lavender, like a seashell left too long in the sun. And though its light hasn't shone in many, many years, someone still climbs its winding stairs every evening. That someone is Ivy. She's a quiet girl, no more than 10, with a braid always loose and eyes full of tide and sky. Her boots scuff the stone steps as she climbs, just like her grandfather used to when he was the keeper. Every evening, without fail, she brings a cloth and a story. She polishes the great brass lamp that hasn't been lit in so long, and she leans her head close to whisper to the sea. Stories of ships and whales, of storms and stars, of messages in bottles that never got read. Below, the town no longer bothers to look out at the water. No sails have graced the bay in years. But Ivy believes the sea still listens, and maybe, just maybe, something out there is listening too. Tonight, the lighthouse is surrounded by dusk. The waves stretch flat and silver to the horizon, and Ivy pauses at the top of the tower. She places her hand gently on the cool glass of the lamp. Somewhere inside her, there's a tiny flicker that hasn't gone out, a hope passed down from the hands of the old keeper. The sea doesn't speak back, but Ivy smiles anyway, because the lighthouse may be quiet, but it's still watching. In the little town cradled by the cliffs, the people no longer glance out at the sea. Once they had watched the waves with eager hearts, shading their eyes and pointing at sails with laughter. But that was long ago. Now they bake bread, mend nets they no longer use, and chat about the price of onions or when the wind might finally turn warmer. They don't even glance toward the lighthouse anymore. To most, it's just an old relic perched on the rocks, paint peeling, windows clouded with salt. Used to be a real harbor, this place, mutters Mr. Pindle, who once sold maps in a tiny shop. Now he sells pickles. No ships come near, says Widow Tess. Not in 20 years. Maybe more. Some of the children play pirate in the streets, but even they roll their eyes at Ivy when she marches up to the lighthouse, her braid swinging, her satchel clinking with polish and rags. They don't understand why she still bothers. Looking for ghost boats again. One boy teases. Ivy only smiles. The grown-ups chuckle gently, not unkindly, but with that sound adults make when they've forgotten how to believe in what they once loved. Most think Ivy's little habit is a game, one she'll grow out of like a too small coat. But Ivy doesn't look back. She keeps climbing, every evening, even when the fog creeps in, even when the sky turns the color of cold iron. Because while the town has turned its back on the sea, Ivy is still watching. And the lighthouse, tall, tired and quiet, waits with her. The townsfolk may not understand Ivy's devotion, but they didn't know her grandfather like she did. Old Keeper Tomlin was not just a lighthouse keeper. He was a storyteller, a sea watcher, and a firm believer in the quiet kind of magic. He used to say, "Every light tells a story, Ivy girl, and every wave remembers it." She remembered his hands, rough from rope, stained with oil, always gentle when guiding hers across the brass fittings of the great lamp. He'd taught her how to wind the mechanisms, how to polish the lens until it caught even the dimmest sunbeam, and how to listen, truly listen, to the gulls, the tide, the air. He'd been gone for 3 years now, but Ivy still kept the little blue notebook he left her, its corners curled and pages scribbled with notes about currents, stars, and the types of wind. Her favorite line was written in big, looping letters. "We keep the light, even when no one's looking." Sometimes she swore she could still hear his footsteps above hers as she climbed the stairs. Just the old tower settling, maybe. Or maybe not. That's why she tended the light. Not for praise. Not for proof. But because of the quiet oath she'd made when he passed. As long as she had breath and boots and a story to tell, the lamp would never be forgotten. And sometimes when the wind curled just right around the lantern glass, Ivy whispered, "We're still watching, Grandpa." The lighthouse never replied. But it didn't have to. The lighthouse had always been painted a strange, soft shade of purple. Not lilac, not plum. Something in between, like the color of sea fog at dawn or a bruise just beginning to fade. It wasn't the usual red and white stripes that dotted other coastlines. No, this tower wore its color like a secret. Grandfather had painted it himself years ago, with leftover marine paint from the docks and a bit of stubbornness. When the townsfolk asked why purple, he'd just grin and say, "So ships remember it. The odd ones are harder to forget." Now the paint was chipped and sun-washed, peeling in long curls like curled ribbon. Moss had taken root near the base, and barn swallows nested in the cracks. Still, Ivy loved it fiercely. To her, the purple tower was more than just stone and stair. It was memory. It was promise. It was a quiet friend with weather-worn skin. She would trace her fingers along the outer wall each evening, patting it like one might an old dog. "Still holding steady," she'd whisper. The lighthouse, of course, said nothing, but Ivy liked to think it stood a little straighter when she did. When fog rolled in, that purple hue disappeared entirely, blending into the sky and sea like a ghost. But when the sunlight hit just right, oh, it glowed. A pale violet crown against the blue. Most of the townsfolk called it odd. Ivy called it perfect, because it didn't matter if people thought it silly. Didn't matter if no boats came anymore. The lighthouse was ready. And purple or not, it remembered what it had been built for. Shine. Evening came gently, the sky melting from gold to rose to blue. Ivy tugged her cardigan close and stepped onto the narrow path that led up the cliff. The wind was mild tonight, brushing past her cheeks like a secret. In her satchel, a cloth, a tiny oil tin, a cracked notebook, and a biscuit just in case. Inside the tower, the air was cool and familiar. Each creaking step of the spiral staircase felt like an old song. Ivy didn't rush, she never did. The lighthouse didn't like to be hurried. Her fingers slid along the rail, worn smooth by time and touch. As she reached the lantern room at the top, she paused, taking in the quiet view. The sea was stretched out like silver fabric, stitched with soft waves and dotted with stars beginning to blink awake. He set to work. First, she wiped the smudges from the glass panels. Circles, then swirls, just like Grandfather had taught her. Then came the gears, gently wound, though they hadn't moved in years. And finally, she placed her palm on the base of the great unlit lamp, warm from the sun it had soaked during the day. Then Ivy whispered. She told the sea a story. Tonight's tale was about a ship made of moonlight, with sails stitched from spider silk and a captain who spoke in riddles. She spoke softly, as if afraid to wake the stars. No one ever listened, of course, but she told them anyway. And when the story ended, she sat on the floor, hugged her knees, and watched the horizon in silence. Because that was the ritual. Not to be seen or even heard, but to keep showing up just in case someone out there was still searching. Some evenings, Ivy could hear the laughter as she passed through the town. Not cruel exactly, just the kind that didn't know what else to do with something different. Off to talk to the waves again. Someone would call from behind a half-closed curtain. "Tell the sea I said hi," a group of boys once hollered before dissolving into giggles. But Ivy never turned around. She had her braid tied tight, her boots laced firm, and her mission tucked deep in her chest like a glowing ember. She'd learned long ago that people often laugh when they've stopped hoping, and Ivy still had hope to spare. At the bakery, Mrs. Dallow would shake her head and hand Ivy a cinnamon roll. "To keep your strength up for all that dreaming," she'd say with a sigh, as if it were some great foolishness. Ivy always said thank you and tucked the warm roll into her satchel beside the oil rag. Even the mayor had once patted her head and told her, kindly but firmly, "Lighthouses are for boats, dear. And we've no more of those." That may have been true. But Ivy believed lighthouses were also for waiting, for watching, for remembering, and so she kept climbing. Up past the town's sighs and the children's teasing. Up into the tower where the wind hummed through the beams and the lantern glass caught the last of the day's light. She wasn't angry at them, not even sad, because one day she thought someone would need the light. And when they did, it would be there. Not because the town believed, but because she did. That night, the fog rolled in without warning. It began as a shimmer on the horizon, just a hint of mist that caught the moonlight and twisted it like ribbon. Ivy, already seated beside the dark lantern, looked up and squinted into the growing haze. The sea disappeared quickly, swallowed by the thick, pale curtain. Even the rocks below were gone now, lost in the slow drift of silver. Ivy stood and pressed her face gently to the glass, her breath fogging the pain from the inside. This fog was different. It wasn't the usual sleepy kind that kissed the cliffs in the early hours. This fog felt awake, alive. It whispered through the cracks in the tower, curling around the beams and wrapping itself around her ankles like curious fingers. The stars blinked out one by one. The moon blurred. The wind fell silent. Only Ivy's breath remained, and the hush of a world held still. She stood at the top of the tower, heart ticking a little faster than usual. The silence felt full, as though it were holding its breath. Her fingers brushed the brass edge of the lamp as she leaned closer to the window. Down below, the town's lights were dull, flickering faintly behind shutters and drawn curtains. No one else noticed the fog. No one else was watching. But Ivy was. Something had changed. She couldn't say how she knew, but she did. She placed her hand on the lamp, just in case. Because sometimes fog didn't just roll in. Sometimes it arrived with a purpose. At first, she thought it was a trick of the mist. Just a shimmer, like moonlight reflecting on a wave, or maybe the glint of a gull's wing catching a star. Ivy narrowed her eyes and leaned in, her forehead pressed gently to the cold window pane. She waited, stillness all around, and then, there it was again. Flicker, tinny, trembling. Far out on the fog-covered sea, barely more than a dot, a faint light wobbled against the darkness. It wasn't the moon. It wasn't a star. It was moving, uneven and slow, like someone trying to walk across water with a candle cupped in both hands. Ivy's heart leapt into her throat. She blinked once, twice, then rubbed the glass and squinted harder. The fog thickened and thinned like breathing, and each time it thinned, the light came closer. Not fast, not steady, but it was coming. No one else would see it. Not from the village. Not through this fog. Only from here. Only from the top of the lighthouse. Ivy felt the tower hold its breath with her, its old stones tense with waiting. She whispered, "There's someone out there." She didn't know who. She didn't know why. But she knew one thing. That little flicker was searching. And she had something to give it. Hope. Stepping back from the glass, Ivy reached for the winding lever. Her fingers trembled. The lamp hadn't been lit in years. Maybe it wouldn't work. Maybe the flame was just too old, too forgotten. But maybe not. And when a light is lost in the dark, even a maybe is worth chasing. Ivy didn't hesitate. She clutched the winding lever with both hands and pulled. The gears groaned in protest, old metal reluctant to move after so many quiet years. But Ivy held on, teeth clenched, arms shaking as she turned and turned. Each crank echoed through the lantern room like a drumbeat. The tower creaked and settled, as if waking from a long, dusty sleep. She dashed to the side panel and lifted the small hatch where the starter wick lay coiled. Her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled with the flint striker. One spark. Another. Nothing caught. Come on. Again. A spark, a hiss, a curl of smoke. And then at last, the wick bloomed into a flickering flame. It was small, shivering, golden. Ivy's breath caught. Carefully, she adjusted the focus lens. The tiny fire stretched outward, magnified by the great glass lens, filling the lantern room with warm amber glow. The beam reached out into the night. It cut through the fog like a sword made of sunlight, slicing the mist in golden arcs that swept across the sea. The lamp was alive again, groaning, whirring, blazing. Down below, the town still slept. But above it, the lighthouse had opened its eyes. Ivy stood beside the lamp, heart pounding. Her cheeks were streaked with oil and tears she didn't remember crying. The light circled steadily now, rhythm strong, reaching again and again across the waves. She turned her gaze to the sea. The tiny flicker on the water had paused. Then, like a moth drawn homeward, it began to move toward her light. The golden beam pulsed gently through the fog, sweeping slow arcs across the ocean's velvet black. Ivy stood motionless beside the lantern, her small frame aglow in the amber wash. The flame, once hesitant, now burned steady and proud, as if it too remembered what it was made for. Outside, the fog didn't disappear, but it softened, letting the light pass. It caught in the air like glitter, swirling around the tower and stretching across the waves like a golden path. And far out on that path, the little light moved forward. Ivy watched as the boat crept closer, still no bigger than a speck. Its lantern swung gently with the rhythm of the tide, a heartbeat in the night. The sea no longer looked empty. It shimmered with purpose. The lighthouse, silent for so long, now hummed quietly around her. The gears whispered. The glass gleamed. The tower itself seemed to lean just slightly toward the boat, as if urging it on. She didn't speak. Not now. Her stories were always for the sea. But this moment was different. This wasn't a tale of moon captains or whispering whales. This was real. Someone out there had been lost in the dark. And someone, somehow, had known there might still be a light waiting. The beam swept past again, steady as breath. Ivy tightened her grip on the railing, knuckles pale. She didn't know who the sailor was. Didn't know how long they'd been drifting. But the lamp was lit now, and it would not go out. The boat drew closer, slow and small against the vastness of the sea. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple sailboat, weather-worn and heavy with travel. Its sails sagged slightly, patched in places with fabric that didn't match. The hull was scuffed, its paint peeling like bark from an old tree. But it moved forward, steady, following the golden beam. Ivy pressed her forehead to the lantern room glass. She could see the tiny figure now, hunched over the tiller, one hand gripping the rope. A lantern hung from the bow, swaying with each soft wave. The sailor's head was down, but Ivy could almost feel the weight of their relief. They'd seen the light. They'd believed it was real. Step by step, wave by wave, the boat slipped closer to the cove at the base of the cliff. Ivy ran to the other side of the tower, peering down through the swirling mist. The narrow beach, usually abandoned, was now touched by gold. Foam curled gently over the sand. Then, with a final glide and a shuddering sigh, the boat came to rest. The sailor didn't leap for joy, didn't cry out or cheer. They simply sat back, shoulders drooping, lantern still swinging, as though the sea itself had exhaled through them. Below, the village still slept. But Ivy stood tall above it all, watching quietly, her hand still resting on the warm brass of the lamp. Someone had come. Someone had been found. And the lighthouse, forgotten, faded, purple as dusk, had done what it was always meant to do. It had guided them home. The mist clung low to the ground as dawn began to stretch sleepy fingers across the sky. One by one, windows in the village creaked open. Lanterns blinked to life. Footsteps padded out onto porches. It wasn't every morning a boat appeared on their quiet shore, especially not after so many years of nothing. Word spread faster than fog. By the time the bell in front of the bakery gave a lazy clang, most of the town had gathered near the beach, shawls wrapped tight, eyes wide and blinking. Children clung to parents' arms. Even Mr. Pindle left his pickle jars unattended. They didn't speak at first. They just stared. There, resting on the pebbled cove, was the little sailboat, damp with sea spray, its wood pale and weary. And next to it stood a stranger, slim and quiet, shoulders sloped as if carrying the last stretch of a long, heavy journey. "Where'd they come from?" someone whispered. "I thought no ships passed here anymore," muttered another. The sailor said nothing, just turned their face upward toward the cliff, toward the lighthouse. And every gaze followed. There, high above, the tower stood aglow. Its beam had softened with the rising sun, but the light still burned faint and gold. And in the lantern room's glass, they could just make out a small figure, still and steady as a statue. It was Ivy, not waving, not bowing, just watching like always. The townsfolk looked at one another, some with awe, some with quiet shame. Because while they'd given up long ago, she hadn't. And now, for the first time in a long, long while, the lighthouse had something to show for all its waiting. The sailor didn't speak right away. They stepped carefully up the stony path, boots soft on the earth, until they reached the edge of the gathering crowd. The townspeople parted like wind through grass, eyes wide, breath caught. The sailor looked tired, not in the way of someone who's just lost sleep, but in the way of someone who's seen too much sky and too little land. Their coat was torn at one shoulder, scarf salt-stiff, fingers raw from rope. But their gaze was clear, green-gray and still like the sea after a storm. Mayor Tilling cleared his throat. "You came from the east." The sailor nodded. How did you find us?" asked Widow Tess, voice barely above the breeze. The sailor's lips curved, just slightly, and they spoke, their voice like wind through canvas. "I didn't. I was lost. For days. Maybe weeks. Fog like milk. Compass gone. No stars. No wind. I'd almost stopped hoping. And then, a light." They looked up toward the lighthouse again. "I thought I imagined it. But it kept blinking. Pulling. I followed it, barely breathing. I don't know how long. And then, suddenly, there was land." The crowd stood in silence, breaths held. Even the children were quiet now. The sailor's voice dropped lower. "I don't know who keeps that light burning. But they saved me." Every head turned toward the tower. Ivy remained still behind the glass, arms folded, face unreadable. She didn't wave. She didn't step outside. But inside, her heart beat like thunder, because someone had found their way. Because the light had done what it was meant to do. Because someone out there had seen it and come home. Ivy didn't come down right away. From the top of the tower, she watched the village gather like sea birds around a rock, their faces turned upward, their mouths quiet for once. The sailor stood at the edge, still gazing at the light, as though unsure whether they were truly awake. Ivy could have rushed down, could have burst through the lighthouse doors and shouted, "See? I told you!" She could have danced or laughed or demanded that someone finally believe her. But she didn't. Instead, she rested her cheek against the glass, still warm from the lamp's glow, and smiled a small, quiet smile, the kind that blooms only in the chest of someone who knew, all along, what everyone else had forgotten. She let the town look. Let them see the light. Let them remember what it meant. And then, as the sun began to rise properly and color the sea in copper and gold, she turned away from the window and began tidying up. She oiled the hinge, folded her polishing cloth, and wound the gear one more turn, just for good measure. Down below, the townsfolk began murmuring to each other in voices soft with wonder. Some even wandered closer to the base of the cliff. A few children tried climbing partway, suddenly curious about the tower they'd once mocked. But Ivy stayed where she was, not for praise, not for fame, just for the light, and for the boat it found. Because some moments don't need applause. Some moments are perfect simply because they happened. And Ivy's smile, unseen from the ground, was brighter than the lamp itself. That night, no one asked Ivy to light the lamp. No one told her she had to. No one offered oil or matches or instructions. But she climbed the stairs just the same. The town had returned to its routines, half-dazed from the morning surprise. But something had changed. You could feel it in the air. In the way the fishermen stood longer at the edge of the dock. In the way the baker left her windows open wider. In the way children stopped to glance, just briefly, up toward the cliff. And at the top of that cliff, the purple lighthouse glowed again. The flame didn't roar like it had the night before. It burned soft and steady, like a candle left in the window. The lens turned slowly, without hurry, its beam sweeping the ocean with patient grace. Ivy watched it spin. The fog had cleared now. The stars had returned. But she knew that didn't mean the light wasn't needed. Just because someone made it home didn't mean others weren't still out there, adrift, unseen, waiting. So she lit the lamp again. Because that's what you do when you're a keeper. You keep things. You keep the flame alive. You keep the stories told. You keep the hope warm even when no one is watching. The lighthouse didn't ask for thanks. Neither did Ivy. She simply sat beside the lamp, notebook on her knees, pencil dancing across the pages. Sketches. A new story forming about a light that waited and a boat that believed. And outside the lantern room, the golden beam turned once more. A signal not just to the sea, but to the world. We're still here. Word spread faster than waves on a rising tide. It started with a single letter. Someone who had heard the sailor's tale in the next harbor over. Then came a second, with a sketch of the purple lighthouse and a note scribbled in messy ink. Was this real? Is it still lit? And more. Dozens. Then hundreds. Sailors who had drifted off course. Families with loved ones lost at sea. Dreamers. Poets. Children who asked if the lighthouse knew fairy tales. All of them sending little envelopes, marked with salt and smudges, addressed simply. The lighthouse on the cliff. The one that waited. The townsfolk, at first bewildered, began to help sort the mail. Mrs. Dallow cleared a shelf in her bakery just for letters. Mayor Tilling even dusted off the old signal horn, just in case more boats needed to find us. Visitors arrived too. Curious travelers. Seaside painters. A child in yellow boots who wanted to see the light that listens. Ivy met them with soft words and warm tea when the wind was cold. She never spoke much about that night. She didn't need to. The lighthouse spoke for itself. Its golden beam became a kind of legend, reliable and quiet, sweeping slow and steady night after night. Some came just to stand at the cliff's edge and close their eyes, letting the warmth of that light soak into their skin. They said it made them feel less lost, less alone. And in the center of it all, the lighthouse stood exactly as it always had. Tall, purple, peeling, proud. Quiet miracle. One that didn't shout or shine the brightest, but one that never stopped believing someone might still need its glow. It wasn't long before Ivy was given a key. Not just any key, the lighthouse key. The one her grandfather had once kept on a loop of twine around his neck. The mayor handed it to her himself, with hands just a little awkward and voice a little cracked. "You've earned this, Ivy. If anyone's the keeper now, it's you." She didn't cry. She simply nodded, wrapped the key in her palm, and whispered a thank you that melted into the sea breeze. That evening, she wore her new badge. A simple patch sewn onto her cardigan by Mrs. Dallow, shaped like a little golden flame. She wore it like it had always been there. Climbing the tower felt different now. Not heavier, not grander, just more hers. Like each step was one more stitch in a promise she'd been weaving all along. She paused at the halfway landing, looked out over the sea and smiled. Inside the lantern room, the light greeted her like an old friend. She moved with practiced care, dusting, winding, checking every gear. Her grandfather's notebook lay on the desk nearby, open to a page titled "Storm Winds and Lantern Hearts." She added her own notes underneath. Because now, Ivy wasn't just the girl who kept a forgotten light burning. She was the keeper. The town knew it. The sea knew it. The birds who circled the tower knew it too. And every time the golden beam swept across the dark, it carried her quiet strength with it. No fanfare, no announcement, just a girl, a lamp, and the same steady hope. Someone might still be searching, and she would still be here. The storm arrived with little warning, rolling in like a beast from beyond the edge of the world. It began with a hush. The birds vanished. The sea, once playful, grew still. Then the clouds came, thick and low and the color of iron. The air crackled with a kind of breathless electricity. The villagers hurried inside, shutters clapping, boots thudding across wooden porches. Mr. Pindle dropped 3 whole jars of pickles on his way to the cellar. Mrs. Dallow snuffed out her bakery's lanterns before the first thunder growled. But Ivy was already halfway up the lighthouse. She moved calmly, cloak snapping behind her, boots firm on the steps. This was what she'd been trained for, not in a classroom, but in all the quiet days and nights she'd spent with the lamp. Her fingers knew every gear, every bolt, every wobble in the staircase. She reached the top just as the first fat drops began to thump against the glass. And still the light glowed. Wind lashed the tower. Rain battered the window panes. Lightning split the sky in violent ribbons. But the beam stayed steady, golden and strong, sweeping out into the chaos without a flicker. Down below, the townsfolk peeked through cracks in their shutters. They didn't need to wonder. They knew the lighthouse was watching. And Ivy. She stood beside the lamp, her silhouette lit from behind, hair damp and wild, eyes focused and unafraid. This wasn't just a storm. This was a test. And the lighthouse, faded, purple, worn thin by time, held fast. Because it wasn't just stone and brass. It was promise. And with Ivy as its keeper, it would not falter. Not now. Not ever. After the storm passed, the wind quieted to a gentle hush, like the world was exhaling at last. The sea shimmered with leftover lightning, and clouds drifted like sleepy ships, their bellies streaked with gold from the rising sun. Ivy remained in the lantern room. The tower was damp. Her cloak clung to her shoulders, and her hair stuck to her cheeks. But she stayed, watching the horizon like she always did. Only now she wasn't alone, not really. Because in the hush between gusts, in the shimmer of the waves, she heard something strange. Whispers. Soft like breath against glass. Not words exactly, but something close. Echoes from the sea. Faint thanks carried on the breeze. Grateful murmurs in voices that didn't quite belong to anyone. Some high and feather-light like gulls. Others low and steady like deep water. It wasn't frightening. Not to Ivy. She stood still and listened. And as she did, she imagined all the boats that might be passing far below the edge of the world. Tiny vessels, still drifting, still looking, still waiting for a light that might one day appear. She imagined them seeing her lamp. Imagined a sailor blinking back tears as the golden beam broke through mist. A child clutching their parent's hand as the lighthouse crown appeared in the distance. A tired voice whispering, "There it is." Ivy placed her hand gently on the glass. "Keep going," she whispered. The whispers in the waves stirred softly, like a page turning in a book. Because that's what the lighthouse had become. Beacon. Home. Story. And Ivy, the girl who once polished a forgotten lamp, had become its voice. The town never quite went back to how it was. How could it? When a light had pierced through fog and a boat had followed it home. When a girl had waited and watched, and believed long after everyone else had stopped. Now in the evenings, a few villagers walked up the winding cliff path. Not to take over, not to interfere, but just to sit quietly in the grass and watch the beam circle the sea. Some brought thermoses of warm tea. Others just brought themselves. The lighthouse stood the same as ever. Its purple walls faded, its steps creaky, its windows dusty with sea salt. But it no longer felt forgotten. Not to the town. And never to Ivy. She still tended it daily. Still told her stories to the waves. Still sketched in her notebook by lamplight, wrapped in her old cardigan and the hush of the sea. The golden beam still swept across the dark each night. Didn't shout. Didn't dazzle. It just moved steadily, gently. Like a heartbeat, like a lullaby. And sometimes, in the deep stillness of midnight, a light would flicker far out on the water. Tiny boat. A wandering ship. A lost traveler. All following the same glow. Because the lighthouse was waiting. Well, always. For anyone who needed it. And Ivy would be there. Polishing the glass. Whispering to the waves. Ready. Just in case. So now, little dreamer, let your eyelids grow heavy. Picture the sea, calm and silver, stretching out beneath a velvet sky. The lighthouse stands on its lonely cliff, wrapped in fog, glowing softly with golden light. Ivy sits by the window, her braid loose, a book open on her lap, the flame flickering beside her. The wind is gentle now, curling like ribbon around the tower. Far below, waves hush the shore. And even farther out, in the great dark of the ocean, someone is drifting closer, following that steady light. You're safe here. No matter how far you've wandered, there's always a way back. And someone somewhere is keeping the lamp lit. Just for you. Sleep well, brave sailor. The night is calm. And the light is still waiting.